Hello, everyone, and welcome to the live stream for Thursday, the 20th of January, 2022. All right, I should be back. I apologize about that. There was some software running on my end, making the video a little weird there for a second. I promise one of these days I will get all of this streaming stuff figured out, but that is, of course, part of the process and where we are in our lives. But thank you for joining me today for this episode on planning for an uncertain future. It came about as a result of the last live stream as we were talking about thinking about different disasters and how those can impact our lives. The request for a live stream on, designing for fires and fire guilds and the possibilities there. And so I wanted to start a little bit earlier in that conversation by looking at just a general way, to look at what we could consider when it comes to the future and putting a plan together, and then using that general conversation to drill down on some more specific thoughts on applying a planning process to our design using permaculture. And yeah, so that's where we're at and where we'll be going for today. One of the thoughts that gets us started in this moment is that a plan never survives contact with reality. I'm sure you've heard that in a lot of different ways. As a long-time tabletop role-playing game player and once frequent dungeon master or game master, I have phrased that as a campaign or an adventure never survives contact with your players. And I open with this because a plan is just something that we can work from and isn't necessarily prescriptive or something that we can just, work with 100%. We're going to need to adapt, change, and overcome over time. But having a plan in place helps us... Oh, sure, let me turn up my volume. There, let me know if that is better now that with that change. I'm working through some technical issues with the audio system on my end. It appears that one of my microphones is damaged and I may need to replace my audio interface. So yeah, let me know if that helps or you'd like me to try to turn it up further. Here, let me go a little bit more. All right, there it's a bit more. Where was I? Yes, that having a plan gives us something to work from. And for me, plans are really important because they help us to determine what our goals are and figure out not necessarily how to react during a situation, but what skills, tools, or equipment or other resources we might need should we need to enact that plan. And this arises, I come from a disaster preparedness background. And so for many years, I had a 3-day bag that was packed and in my car. I came to permaculture because of wanting to have a community approach to what was considered a potential, pretty large disaster with the Y2K switchover. So a lot of my work within permaculture is around this space. And then I also reached out to my wife. I talked to her over dinner. I talked to my wife over dinner about presenting on this topic for the live stream because of her background in emergency management and how much these plans are important for that as well. And just, by putting a plan together, it can be super helpful for what we're doing. And so one of the things that both my wife and I agreed on was that when it comes to our planning is to think about the most improbable or impossible or absolute worst disaster we can imagine. as permaculture practitioners, that's likely, total ecological collapse as a result of climate change. And so it's starting there. Now, we may not be able to do anything in regards to that kind of collapse except to make it as gentle as possible. And we may want to plan for that. Depends on where you are. But then once we know what the absolute worst is that could happen, to step back from that a little and about what is most likely to happen, and then find a space in between there that we operate from. When I was still heavily involved in individual disaster preparedness, packing a 3-day bag, and some of those other things, the life that I lived meant that having a bug out bag wasn't as necessary in that space at that time. And so, like, now where my wife and I are in Northern Virginia, we've adjusted as well. We don't necessarily keep bags packed, but we have all of our emergency resources in places where they can be grabbed quickly and we can head out of the house. Because of where, I work from home, my wife doesn't work particularly far from here. And so if we did need to get back to each other, we could likely do it with just what we have on hand. And I'll get into more of that when it comes to like some everyday carry suggestions that I have here in a bit. But yeah, so that's where having a realistic idea of what you're going to encounter 90% of the time or 95% of the time can create a lot of resilience in our personal lives and help us in the short term get the skills and tools that we need to make our lives more comfortable. It's where I always recommend trying to stock at least 4 to 6 weeks worth of food that you want to eat. What you want to eat is super important to me because there are all kinds of like survival foods that are on the market that you can buy, but if you're not familiar with them, they're not really useful to yourself when it comes to your plan. But again, if you are somebody who backpacks with dehydrated food often or over long distances and you feel comfortable with those kinds of food in your pantry because you can and will use them before they expire, then certainly get them. And that's where, the plan comes in place. So let's walk through what my planning used to look like when I lived in Pennsylvania. And I can compare that a little bit to what my planning is like here in Virginia. And then we can forecast this into the future as permaculture practitioners and be able to start looking at how we could integrate a permaculture design methodology into our long-term planning about an uncertain future, and how we can use the ideas of disaster preparedness and planning and combine that with the model of permaculture and bring them together then so that we can have a holistic plan that sees us very far into the future. So, yes, there's this possibility of complete and entire ecological collapse and the disintegration of our biosphere. If that's the case, I'm just going to do what I can to make it a gentle landing for everybody in the world who I can. When it comes to my personal life, when I was in Pennsylvania, I used to participate pretty heavily with a group known as the Zombie Squad out of St. Louis, and their premise for what's the worst disaster that could happen were zombie outbreak. Like George Romero, Day of the Dead kind of zombie movies, and how would we react to a zombie outbreak? And then the lessons that we could learn from workshopping a zombie outbreak, we could then use to use in our everyday lives. And I loved that group a lot. I don't know if they're still out there. I didn't have the chance to check while setting up the stream today, but when we were doing that as a thought exercise, that was what they really meant. It is zombies. And then, there were some rules and ideas around that with what were acceptable behaviors or not. So this was a group that was very big about community support and engagement. So it wasn't, we're going to stockpile a bunch of weapons and then go raid a Walmart when a disaster strikes. It's we're going to do all the preparation we can to be a help to our community. And that kind of a thought is part of what informs most of my work when it comes to permaculture or conversations like this about uncertainty. So you might want to use that as your exercise, a zombie outbreak, as something that is in between your everyday disasters and that complete biosphere collapse. And if you need some inspiration, throw on a good horror movie or a zombie movie, watch it and go, they're not making a good decision here. What would I do differently? And yeah, it can also just be fun for a movie night. Or when we were talking about community preparedness and community planning in the last live stream, bringing people together and having that kind of a thought exercise could be a good way to bring folks together and have the conversation. Hey, let's watch a zombie movie and talk about what they get wrong, and then see what your friends have to say and how you might be able to inform that conversation. But that's awesome. I apologize. There's a lot of vowels and some L's in there, OI. So if you'd like to drop a nickname or a way that I should refer to you during the stream into the chat, please do. Otherwise, I'll refer to you as OI. And looking back, oh, good. The audio is better. Corinne, yeah, I agree with the idea of bug out bags and having the lists available and knowing where the gear is. But unless you regularly attend to your bug out bag and its contents, where you are going through and making sure your food isn't expired, making sure that your batteries and your flashlights or whatever gear you carry in there is still in good order, I've moved away from the idea of keeping one packed all the time towards something that is easy to equip, because I know where everything in my house is. Yeah, and that was just one of the issues that I found with bug out bags and a lot of the discourse around them when they were super popular 8 to 10 years ago in the disaster preparedness community, was that a lot of folks would pack them and forget them. And then it's like, well, how are you going to be able to use that when you need it? And also revisiting them over time, so that you make sure that what you have in them is up to date and what is most useful for where you are now, what your situation is, and what might have changed since then. But I'll touch on that a bit more here in a moment. And that's where, when I was living in Pennsylvania during my marriage to my children's mother, I think some of you know that I have divorced and married again. So my wife, who I refer to, is not my children's mother. But when I was in Pennsylvania, we lived in an area that flooded regularly. We knew that we were going to lose power usually for about 10 days a year because of storms and outages. And then also snow would usually snow us in for 3 or 4 days at least a year. And that was what really molded a lot of my thoughts on, okay, if we're in a disaster and it floods, the house itself has never gotten wet. Even with the most torrential, like 100-year style floods, the water would still need to rise another foot or two before it got to the house. Okay, knowing that we're not likely to have to flee during a flood event, unless it was something that, like the dam that was on the stream near our house ruptured, and at that point there was no warning system or anything, so there was no way that we could get out if it were going to happen. As a family, we had also lived with flooding so much that we could watch weather reports and be able to make a determination about whether or not we would need to leave, and we always had warning signs because of how water would move through the property of when we would need to get out. Even in the worst torrential downpours, it was never we need to get in the car right now and leave. But we could prepare for that. And so, my children and I and their mother having conversations about, when would you like to leave? When do you think it's most appropriate for us to get in the car and head out of here? Knowing that we might want to head out, picking routes ahead of time and knowing where we're going to go. And this is where, when you put a plan together like this, what I would recommend is sitting down with your family and workshop both those worst case scenarios as well as what you're likely to encounter. Figure out what your 95 or 99% disasters are going to be. The things that you're likely going to need to respond to every year or every 2 or 3 years. Just what are the things that happen in your life? What have you done? And that could be anything from these kinds of natural disasters that I've talked about so far. I was here in Washington, D.C. on January 6th, 2021, which went more kinetic than we initially expected. And so, we were creating a plan on the fly during that moment based on our other emergency management work. We're within walking distance. Yes, a bit of a long walk, but not unsurmountable from the White House and the Capitol to where we are here in Northern Virginia. It's like, okay, if something like this happens again, what do we do? Where do we go? How do we respond to this? Because of traffic in this area, it became pretty clear to my wife and I that our initial reaction would be to shelter in place. And that's our primary reaction to most things because of the other pieces of the plan that we've put together. We can stay in our home for some time without having to leave. Virtually any disaster that comes, which is different from where I was in Pennsylvania, where it's like, okay, there's flooding, we may need to get out of here. And then there is in Pennsylvania that thought of being snowed in for a number of days, not being able to leave. Okay, well, what's a good reaction to that? How can we look at that idea, and what would we do? What's the longest we've ever been snowed in? What if we double or triple the amount of time that we could be snowed in, and how does that change our planning? And that's where these less likely scenarios, the zombie planning and other pieces come in. As you start to put a plan together, extend them, change them. How would we respond if this was the disaster and this happened? As like Corinne, you mentioned with a tsunami advisory, that's not something I've ever encountered here on the East Coast. So that's a completely different exercise for me. And so for those of you who are here on the live stream, if you could or want to, how would you respond to a tsunami or a tsunami advisory or warning, or just if you lived in an area where tsunamis are even likely? If that's the disaster that you are putting a plan together around, what are your thoughts on what you would do with that? And if you want to, just drop that into the chat and we can talk about that a little. Similarly, like the distinction between Pennsylvania and Virginia, in Pennsylvania, we could head north from where we lived pretty easily. We had several... The road that we were on did not have a lot of ways off of it, but if we could take that road and we're not blocked in because of it, there were a lot of options for us to get away from population centers and find safe places to stay. In the case of flooding or something like that, we wouldn't necessarily have to look for like a hotel that was near us. We could drive an hour or two north. If we wanted to, we could go to New York. And again, having that idea of where to go and what to do can be really important. And this is where, again, putting a plan together, listing out what you might need to respond to, and then what are your different options, extending your concepts of what could occur and figuring out what you need on hand to take care of that. Where my wife and I are now in Virginia, we went through, January 6th, decided that yes, something like that, or civil disruption, or anything sheltering in place is our first choice. The population here is so high that trying to get in a car and get anywhere is extremely difficult. Even something as simple as end of week traffic for the commute can really shut down your ability to get anywhere. And it's, being here, one of the things that my wife and I talk about is that it's often easier for us to get to Frederick, Maryland, which is 45 I think it's like 40 or 45 miles from here than it is to get to some of the places we might want to go in Washington, D.C., because of how traffic and travel stacks up. With our other plans, we've lost power here more times and for longer than I ever did in Pennsylvania. And so that's changed the way that we plan for power outages. The last time that it happened, it was long enough that the food that was in our refrigerator was no longer safe for consumption, including the freezer. It happened that long. So, we don't keep a lot of perishable foods in the house in the way that we used to. We tend to grocery shop twice a week for what we will need over the next couple of days so that we don't have that food loss again because of how expensive it was. While at the same time keeping dry goods on hand so that if we can't get to the grocery stores for some reason or because of some of the shortages and outages that have occurred lately, that we can still reliably cook food that is healthy and nutritious for us that we will eat. And so we use a pantry rotation plan where it's, a first in, first out, and we only buy, as I said earlier, food that we'll eat. And I think about food on the road also for like bug out bags. Again, because most of our disasters are only going to be a couple days, keeping some ready-eat food on hand. Granola bars, peanut butter, jelly. So if you want to, you can grab a loaf of bread and make peanut butter and jelly on the go, that you have some things that are on hand. If you have any kind of a way to heat water, some shelf-stable boiling bag supplies are really good. And so, there's just a lot of different ways that you can make sure that you have food on hand. And this constant referral back to food and keeping things at home to see you through a disaster or a crisis or anything like that is a super important part of the plan for me, because if we can feed ourselves and take care of ourselves and stay out of the line of a short-term disaster, then we can learn lessons from that experience that means then that we can plan longer term. But while also ensuring that we are not a drain on our local resources, and again, as permaculture practitioners, can engage in people care and give back. And let me know if you have any other questions about this like short-term disaster planning piece of it. I'm going to transition to some other thoughts that should bridge us to the permaculture piece and then look at the long-term planning. But if you have any questions on this initial like workshopping what your likely disasters are, having the improbable situations included in that, just drop those into the chat and we can talk about those. While you do that, if you'd like to, one book that my wife recommended to me from her personal library that I had not read, that is one that I definitely am looking forward to reading in more detail and that I would recommend, is Lee Clark's Mission Improbable. Let's see how that shows up. Using fantasy documents to tame disaster. Absolutely fabulous way to come up with scenarios and ideas that are outside the norm that can help us to think differently. As a big fan of fantasy, if I found out that my family member had left me a dangerous magical ring and a wizard was at my door, what would I do to get it to Mount Doom? What is the trip and the travel, and what skills or experience would I need to do that? And, playing with those kinds of ideas. And then as I come up with a list, taking the time to develop those skills. Part of working through this is there's the preparedness portion of this. And for me, I focus a lot more on skills, not stuff. So it's about preparing ourselves, our friends, our family with the skills that we need to be resilient in whatever situation we find ourselves in. and to continually update, change, and adapt that while we, you know, work our plans, and being open to revisiting them over time. It's, again, when I had a bug out bag, there was all kinds of stuff in there, but whenever I would grab it for something, that was minor, I just realized that I wasn't using a lot of the stuff that was there, that it was built around a certain supposition of what would be needed in a disaster. And so I've continued to work on more and more skills. And in doing so, that has greatly reduced what I would necessarily grab if I had to get out of the house. And that's where, if you don't know about it or aren't familiar with it, there's this, I don't know where exactly it comes from. I got involved with it out of the disaster preparedness community, but the idea of everyday carry and certain things that you have with you all the time. In my pockets, in addition to my wallet and cell phone, for me, I always carry a knife, a lighter, and a flashlight. Around my house, within arm's length, almost any time that I could want or need it, is a lighter, a flashlight, and some kind of a pocket knife. I've got a Swiss Army knife right here on my desk. I think behind me, yeah, I've got, two different lighters available. I've got a flashlight, another pocket knife. I will say that collecting knives is one of my hobbies, so that is one of the reasons why I have as many as I do. But for me, having a good quality knife, flashlight, and a way to make fire are there because those are tools that I use frequently in my everyday life, and are also ones that I would have a hard time replicating in an emergency. And, I have a flint knapping kit. I think it, yeah. Yeah, I have a flint knapping kit right behind me on the floor of my bookshelf, and I could make sharp objects with it, but it's not something that I would want to do necessarily in a moment where I'm trying to respond to something. But again, I also developed those skills because, let me turn this off real quick. I developed flint knapping skills because they were useful, and I just enjoyed doing it, and it kind of stemmed from some anthropology and archaeology classes that I took. And then my friend Jason Godesky, who joins the live streams from time to time, who I've known for many years, we've joked that the world that we would ultimately like to live in is wigwams with Wi-Fi. And so that's a skill set that I found really useful, being able to do that. And it's also that many of the skills that are labeled as primitive skills are ones that still apply to our day-to-day life. I use this. There's a technique that I learned is lacing related to pottery, but I can't tell you the number of containers and recycling bins and trash cans and things that I've been able to repair quickly and easily by learning about that method. When my children were interested in archery, we were making bows out of PVC pipes and arrows out of a local water reed, and I was able to knap together some glass arrowheads out of liquor bottles and heavy-bottomed beer bottles. And those are skills that, if you're interested in, I would highly recommend trying out, because there's just so much there, and there are a lot of great books on them, which reminds me, I will drop some books into the comment section for this video that I would recommend that I've used over the years to develop those skills. But yeah, that's where, again, as we put a plan together and recognize what we use every day, how do we make sure that we have it available to us? If we're finding that we need certain skills, what can we do to generate them, and where do we find them? And as always, I am really kind of leaning into the permaculture librarian that some of my colleagues have suggested as kind of like my role in the community. So if at any point there is anything that you'd like to learn more about that we talk about today, or if you're watching this on a rewatch, always feel free to drop me an email. This is going to be the easiest way to get in touch with me. I try to clear my inbox at least once a week and respond to everybody. So if you send me something, I will be in touch within a week or so. And I'm always happy to answer any questions via email that way and give anyone half an hour of my time for anything that you're working through. Of course, if you'd like to talk with me one-on-one and have a longer conversation, then feel free to find me and book a meandering at calendly.com/permaculture podcast. Or no, I'm sorry, that's calendly.com/permaculture. I'll have a graphic ready for the next live stream so I can share that. But I'm always more than happy to share any thoughts, ideas, or resources that I can with you to get you where you want to be. But that skill development for me also ties into permaculture because of the idea from the Transition Town movement and other permaculture conversations about reskilling and what we can do to be able to care for ourselves in those moments. With that skills not stuff approach, taking the time to invest in yourself and what you use. So if there's a class that you want to take and you can, go take it. If there's a book that you want to read on a subject and it's available in your library or you feel comfortable wanting to purchase it, then definitely do it. These are taking this time. I use the word investment. I don't necessarily like that phrase as we work on ourselves and the world around us, but yeah, I'll use it for now. But doing this often pays us back in ways that far outstrip the costs. It's, Ben Falk talks about if you plant an apple tree today, its returns will be greater than any money that you could put in the stock market. And I definitely agree with that. And that's where, with whatever form of capital you need to, get the training you'd like, develop the skills that you need to, try the tools that are out there. If something is outside of what you can potentially afford right now, and you're looking for other options, let me know. I have a huge network of people and information that, as I say, I'm more than happy to share with you. If you're looking to buy your first pocket knife, I have some great recommends from my life in that world. But, definitely feel free to have that conversation. If there's something that you're really good at that you'd like to share with people, and maybe we can do a virtual skill share over Zoom or a live stream like this, drop a comment for this video and let me know, or again, contact me directly. That idea of, taking this time and working on ourselves and developing these skills and all, that's also where I feel I have a similar perspective when it comes to our tools and equipment. So there's the idea in some circles of try once, buy twice, so that if there's something that you need that you don't know that you'll necessarily use frequently, then it's okay to buy the least expensive version and use it. See if it works, see what you like about it, see what you don't. And then if you find that you really like it, then get the better version of something. And that's where I've gone over the years with most of my garden tools, with most of the equipment that I use in my life, to find what really works. The same for me goes for food and our permaculture practices. Invest in what you use. So if you're going to plant seeds, plant food that you already are going to eat, or foods that you already like to eat. For those pieces that you really like that maybe you can't grow, I've grown grain before, and it is not something that I enjoy, and so I would not be growing grains for breads or pasta, my celiac disease notwithstanding. And so what can I stock or substitute in that space? I think to the conversation with Amy Rose Fole about why she started giving all of her food away as a farmer was because she was not in a place working her job and farming to be able to preserve everything. I've had an amazing all-American canner, but I didn't can with it. I was more likely to use my dehydrator than my canner, and now I don't have either with where we're at in Virginia. And so for me, I find that it's less expensive and easier in many cases to stock those things. But this also goes into that long term planning that as permaculture practitioners, once we have our 3 to 5 year plan in place, we can start to look further out. Look at those bigger things that are less likely to happen in our lives and apply permaculture to our short-term disaster management so that we can look out into the future and plan for it. Once you've made your list of the worst that could happen and the most likely that's going to happen, start thinking about those things that could happen in 10 or 15 or 20 years and workshop them in the same way. Make your list of the skills that you would need to respond to that, or how that would make you need to change what you would like to plant for your garden, or how that might impact your community. You know, as a parent and in my 40s and recognizing that thought of being sandwiched by the younger and older generations, if my parents aren't healthy enough to take care of themselves in 10 years, what am I doing? Am I in a place where I would include them in my community plan and want to have a home where we could be multi-generational? And if so, what does that look like versus where I am now in an apartment in Northern Virginia that has enough room for my wife and I and our children? So like that can be a part of our plan as we're thinking about people care. When we're thinking about the disasters that could come with climate change, looking at things like the International Climate Change Panel, ICCP. But yeah, looking at those reports, what is being projected for what we might expect for climate change where we're living, if it's likely to become hotter and drier, what can we be planting now to prepare for that in order to help naturalize seeds to the soil that we're on? Where are the analogs in the world around us that already look like what our home might look like in 15 or 20 years? As we look at the social side of things, where are the connections that we have within our community and where can we make them? What would make us feel more comfortable or connected for the things that we know that we can't personally prepare for, or the skills that we're not necessarily interested in? As an example, having been a hunter off and on through my life, I'm not very good at processing game, and it's something that I would rather have somebody else do. And so is there somebody in my community who does that? And can I get to know them now for the future? I should say large game in particular. If we're not in a place to grow food, who can we support and build relationships with now who are in our community who do grow food? Finding out where the farmers are that are within a walking distance or bike ride should we not have access to transportation or a vehicle. Corinne, as you say that you're still working with one car, so you tend to shelter in place as well. I look at that as well. My wife and I have one car, and so I would need to shelter in place until we could make a different decision. But in looking at some of the bigger examples, like when January 6th happened, we had certain friends reach out to us and said, hey, you can come and stay with us for a while. So we've continued those conversations and extended the same invitation in reciprocity to them, because our home, even though we're limited in bedrooms, my wife and I planned our space to be able to house more than just us and our family if need be. You know, having a futon that folds out, having some sleeping bags and some mats or cots, because, you know, when I go on the road to do in-person interviews, though it's been a couple of years, I still have my camping gear. So I've got my tent, I've got my cot, I've got all of those things. And that was part of my wife and I's planning for our space, so that if one of our friends needed it, they have a place to stay. And as I say, we can house more than just a couple, that we can house our family and then another family if need be. And yeah, that's where I look outwards as permaculture practitioners to be including those kinds of thoughts when we're doing permaculture design. Once we have the landscape together, revisit the social and the economic and those other pieces. Look at the 8 forms of capital, both now where we are and how we're living and how we can give that back, or in how we can use those various forms of capital to give back. I believe I mentioned that a good friend gifted me some money at the end of the year to grow out the podcast. And that came from a place that, as they shared with me, and if you're listening, I won't out you, but I thank you again, that because I am in a place to continue this permaculture work, that I am doing something for both of us by doing so, while they work a job that provides them with financial capital to be able to do these kinds of things. And so, it encourages me and inspires me to continue this work more fully, even though I might not be where I want to be from an economic perspective, because what I am doing matters to my friend, to those of you who tune in. And so it's even though I am not good at making money, I never have been, I'm really good at being available when people need it. So how do I continue to work to that strength? While finding support through people like my friend, or those of you who support the show on Patreon and elsewhere, to make the most of those gifts to give back. And then again, how can I use these skills in the future if the show goes away? Because there's a change and podcasting is no longer a thing. Maybe the internet's no longer a thing. And I'm now in a hyper-local space. How do all these skills about talking and teaching translate to the community that I'm in, and what can I use? Well, can you or have you done that kind of personal self-assessment so that you can look at the ways that you can impact the world through the various forms of, again, I don't like the term capital, but the different ways that you manifest and show up in the world, the resources that you bring for being the amazing, beautiful, and unique human being that you are. And yeah, include those kinds of thoughts in your permaculture plan beyond the landscape. But again, start with a simple plan. Look at where you are and what your inputs and outputs are, what your immediate needs are. Put that permaculture plan together, make your plant lists, make your equipment lists, do that design, and then add these uncertain pieces on top of it. And there's an idea that I will be returning to frequently in live streams and other conversations moving forward, which is about this idea of working your design. And I come to this because of the conversations that I had with Rosemary Morrow, which gave language to something that I personally have been working through, and in some ways, if you will, kind of struggling with, is that permaculture conversations in various spaces ultimately boil down to techniques. And as I said in a recent live stream, that the techniques are not permaculture. Permaculture is in the ethics and principles and what we create from them. And that I would like to see us escape the design trap in order to become better permaculture practitioners. And so as you put together your permaculture designs and you add these different layers on top of them, I go back to then work the design, and with it work the plan, so that if there is a question that arises, see if look at your design, ask yourself the question again, and see see where the hole is. Why can't you answer that question? Is it because you didn't design for that question? If so, go back, rework your design, and you'll answer that question. If you find that there are holes in your design as you respond to things in your life, go back and work the design to fill in around those holes. If you have something that changes in your life, in whatever way, go back to your design, look it over, compare it against the changing situation, compare it against the situation that you're in and how your situation changed since the last time you visited your design. Why is there a disconnect? Figure out where that comes in, where those holes are from, and then your design can help you answer, again, any questions that you have, or help you respond to the situation that you're in. Your design ultimately becomes a holistic plan for all of your permaculture, whether it's your backyard garden, whether you run a farm, whether you're in a city, whether you're trying to look out 10, 25, or 50 years, you can include all of that in your permaculture design. And then whenever you have any questions, your design is also your plan. And, when you look at your design, it lets you know how you will respond in certain situations. From how you'll respond will help you find the skills that you need or where they're missing. And again, it just keeps building and building and growing on that. Now, if you're someone who's new to permaculture and are trying to figure some of this out and don't know the questions to ask, that's a different conversation. If you've taken a permaculture design course, at the end of a permaculture design course, you should be able to design well enough after you've had some experience doing this. So, a permaculture design course plus a year or two of practice. Corinne, I apologize. I didn't see that comment come up. But you say learning about other forms of capital. Is that something you're learning today, or a question, or can I dig in a bit deeper about that while we're here? If you have any questions. But yeah, drop those in the chat. I'll finish this line of thought and then glance over again. So yeah, that's where if you've taken a permaculture design course and you've been doing this and you have a couple of years doing this, asking where to put in a swale isn't a question that you should need to ask. Your research and your permaculture work should answer that. If you're still trying to figure out swales because they don't make sense for whatever reason, then let's have a conversation about it on a higher level, so that then you can understand why they're used and where they go, and then that is something then that you have a better knowledge of. When it comes to really anything that becomes a technique in permaculture, your design work should answer. And if it doesn't, and you don't know why, again, let me know. I really do mean it. Anytime, anywhere, any question, feel free to send it to me via email, show@thepermaculturepodcast.com. You can also call or text 717-827-6266. And I'm also on WhatsApp at +1 and that same number. So, WhatsApp +1 717-827-6266. I'm more than happy to help you through some of those questions if you have them. But the space that I am in is about thinking about this from the permaculture perspective of ethics, principles, design. The strategies and techniques and everything else we use descend from those. And if you're having questions about either of those, then there's a hole somewhere higher up in your order, and it's those holes that I want to help you fill in. And those related questions to help you answer. Okay, so learning about other forms of capital, your podcast with 8 forms. I'm learning that there are multiple forms of value outside of liquid monies. It's, yeah. Let me speak to that for a moment, Corinne, while you're here, and then I can get to the last couple of thoughts that I have on this preparing for an uncertain future piece. And then if we have any final questions, we can close out the live stream here in about 10 or 15 minutes. I was able to live in the gift economy because of this idea of other forms of value beyond the financial. And I'm really thankful to Ethan Solivave and Gregory Landway for their article on it, which, maybe we should do a conversation on the 8 forms of capital. Their book I really enjoyed, but it was definitely a book for business practitioners and not from a permaculture perspective. Their initial article on it, I feel, is much more appropriate for permaculture practitioners, because once you read through their article, which is only a couple of pages, I find that it's more accessible than the book, and it clarifies a lot of these different ways that we can come to the table as permaculture practitioners. And as I was saying, my ability to live in the gift economy comes from an understanding of that. Like, there was a period where I lived in an intentional community, and I was there doing my best to run the podcast, be a father to my children, and give back to my community, because I have my skill set beyond a teacher and a permaculture practitioner. As I say, if I have any expertise at all, are the skills that keep a household economy running. I can replace a sink, fix a drain, clear a drain, cook for 2 people, cook for 1 person, cook for a dozen, wash clothes, mend clothes, repair shoes. I can't darn socks. It is not something that I can do, but I know how to crochet and knit. I can run a sewing machine. I was a costumer for a while because I did reenactment I was a costumer for a while because I did reenactment with the Society for Creative Anachronism. And so know how to make clothing from scratch if I have fabric. Being able to I'm forgetting the phrase in the moment, but I can measure and lay out a pattern and cut fabric from that and make clothing from, as long as I have fabric. All of those skills that go into a household economy are part of what I just have because of the way that my parents were and all of that. And so that's what I bring with me all the time. I've helped at permaculture courses with, making sure everybody is fed, making sure everybody has snacks. During my permaculture design course itself, I would grab food from my local farmer's market and bring that. And that was one of the things that we came together around. And my permaculture teachers would joke, "Hey, Scott, what did you bring for us today?" And I always had something. And that's really a large part of where I come from, is all of those pieces. My ability to show up and provide space for people is, something else that I give back to those folks around me. I have lived on less than $5,000 a year, and I worked a job once that was paying me more than that per week. I've been all over the place. But my ability to practice permaculture and continue the show comes from having more to give than just money. And even some of my friends who say, well, all I do is I work a job, and that means that, I can give cash to people, and that's how I provide value back to the community. There's also some of the most amazing people I know when it comes to having hard conversations about what it means to exist in our society under capitalism. And there's no way that I could put a dollar figure on the impact that they've had on my life because of being able to speak with them about it, or watching them advocate for others, or to actually take their perspective and implement it in the world. For my friends who believe in solidarity and mutual aid, that they help other people, sometimes anonymously, sometimes directly, sometimes just by standing in solidarity with others, by not crossing picket lines or not boycotting. And just, there's so much that we can do. And that's where, even though I might not have been able to pay people financially for some of the, or even though I haven't necessarily been able to reciprocate financially when living in an intentional community, when a friend allowed me to live in their spare bedroom for some time, that it was, when I go pick up snacks, making sure there's still some on the counter, specifically for them, taking the time to sit and talk with them when they needed it. There's just so much that we can do as permaculture practitioners and human beings in this world that I would like to see us be able to detach from needing to continually monetarily value things. I'd also like to move away from all of this financial language like capital, and be able to say more about, I share or give money. I share or give time. I share or give my skills. I share or give my knowledge. I share or give spiritual space or counsel if that's a place where we engage in, as a lay minister or a regular minister, or if we practice, Buddhism or some other spiritual, engagement or practice, that we can give and share those as well. While also, being able to talk to the resources that we have available to us. I mean, I still continue the show not because of where the financial income from it is, but because my wife and my friends believe in this. And that as long as we can live comfortably and okay, the show doesn't have to make tens of thousands of dollars for it to continue to exist. It needs to be able to pay for itself and what I do as a result of it. And that's where, Patreon does pay for the regular production of the show. And that's really amazing and exciting. And so now how do I increase that, or where do I get to the point so that I can go out on the road and do in-person interviews and do some of this video documentary work that I went to? How do I figure out how to offer permaculture design courses that continue to be accessible and affordable? The same with the homeschooling material as well, because I would love to do some more pay what you can or pay what you want. And yeah, so those are some things that I'm exploring as well, for me to be able to continue to work in this liminal space that is between capitalism as it exists and needing to earn money because I'd like to eat and have a place to live, honoring the people who believe in this work and so have supported me in a variety of ways so that I can keep doing it, as well as being able to continue to give to people who are outside of that financial space and still be able to keep the show, no, I shouldn't say that. The show itself is going to remain open at the point of access forever, and as long as I can. It's just deciding whether or not I need to take a day job in order for these other pieces to come to fruition. And in doing so, does that mean the show can continue? Looking at the hours that currently go into it, or, a part-time or something. But anyway, that's all stuff that we can get into. But as I share that candor for what's occurring to me behind the scenes, those are things that I'd like you to think about as well in your own life. There's this piece that I ran across with a business development community years ago, and I forget, if I remember the name of the community, I will let you know. But their conversation was like, what is your bare minimum? What is the absolute bare minimum that you need to earn to live your life if we want to examine it financially? And again, this also goes into, this loops back to my conversation about creating your plan and working your plan. With our permaculture practices, as we engage in permaculture, we can reduce the amount of financial resources that we need in order to live. Corinne, what you say about liquid monies, that we can live with less cash on hand or in the bank or from what we earn if we work outside of our home economy or for someone else, or if we own our own business. So doing that assessment of what is my absolute financial floor for income, Where am I at? What do I have to earn? What does my family need? And doing that in a way that includes all your needs, because things like our mental health and our hobbies and what we engage in to take care of ourselves is important. As I say, I know I'm a knife collector for various reasons. I make cocktails as one of my hobbies. I play role playing games and board games with my friends and family. And so having a line item for those interests in my needs assessment is super important to my mental health and well-being. And that's one of the things that my wife mentioned to me. Is she recommended another book, which feels like a good place to bring it in, is James Halpern and Mary Tramontin wrote the book Disaster, Mental Health, Theory and Practice. Again, it's a very professional book. You can see it was one of my wife's college textbooks. We got that sticker on there from the school bookstore. But that was one of the pieces that my wife and I talked about in preparation for today's live stream that I hadn't considered. In putting together my own outline for the conversation today, I was thinking about food and permaculture design and these very basic, the core, absolute bottom of Maslow's hierarchy of like food, shelter, clothing, water kind of things. And I'm glad that she reminded me of mental health, because this long-term ongoing pandemic, I know personally my mental health has suffered some. And it took a while to recognize the space that I was in and be able to lean into my support network. And even though my mental health took a bit of a hit, because of how long this has gone on, recognizing what my support network is, who my support network is, and what my needs are when I am not doing well. And being able to engage in my hobbies is part of that, you know. Picking up a pocket knife every couple of months to explore and try and see how it's different because of its materials or its handle or its size or its shape and all these things that knife nerds are into. I really enjoy that. When my wife comes home and we're having dinner and she asks me to make an old fashioned, being able to ask, hey babe, what bourbon do you want tonight and what bitters should I use? Makes a big difference. When she was unable to drink alcohol, exploring mocktails and then being able to have mocktail parties with our kids, still kind of falls into this cocktail hobby. And like, that's super important and makes me feel great. And so, yeah, think about your mental health as part of that as well and what you need from that. And looking at those aspects as part of your design and your plan. There's the idea in permaculture of zone 0, which is our home or domicile or residence or where we live. And I've talked before about this idea of permaculture from the inside out. Even though I didn't like the idea of zone 00 in the beginning of my permaculture practice, I've come to really like it and feel that we need to include ourself in our permaculture design and what we need to be well and do well. And so that when we're designing, it's knowing, like, how do you handle not sleeping well one night? What do you need to make sure that you do sleep well and the impacts that can have on your mental health? And I mention that because of how many health concerns a lack of sleep can mimic. As someone who was diagnosed with ADHD later in life as an adult, it took me several months to work with my doctor and psychologist to get the diagnosis, because we needed to take care of my stress levels and bring those down. We needed to make sure that I was sleeping well because of what that mimics. We needed to make sure that the symptoms that I had were not, something like depression or anxiety. And then as we worked through all that, arrived at that diagnosis. But having gone through that process and some of the other pieces that I've mentioned, understanding how important all of that is to my well-being. And I'd like to make sure that you and the people you work with, whether you're just designing personally or professionally, that you include some of that in the conversation. If you're a professional permaculture practitioner, a lot of times we're called in to build out a landscape-based design. But the importance of working in the non-landscape pieces into our work as permaculture practitioners and making sure that that's being addressed. And there's another book. Hold on. Let me make sure I have the title right, because I think I got it wrong last time. But when it comes to these things, there are two books that I didn't prepare to have as part of this conversation. In putting my notes together, I do have a recommended book list that I'll share with you here in a minute. Two other books that come to mind are Rebecca Solnitz, A Paradise Built in Hell, because she investigates what happens among disasters and grief and disruptions, and it's an awesome book. It's a really good book, and I think that it's why I like it from a permaculture perspective is because it gives us insights into how human beings react when things get bad. And that really matters to me, because what we see or hear on the news is on the news because it doesn't happen every day. It's on the news because it is something that stands out in our lives. But because we have a 24-hour news cycle, it's easy to constantly be receiving inputs that don't actually reflect reality around us. And goes back to what I started this conversation with today, once I got the mics and everything together, was that, none of our plans will survive contact with reality, but we have to have good inputs to know what is likely to happen in reality. And though I've always cared about people, there were certain circles that I used to walk in that are radically different from my current politics or some of the groups that I engaged in disaster preparedness with, that were all about, I need a compound, I need guns because I am afraid of the world and what could happen if my neighbors want some of my food. And to me, that became a terrible way to live, to think about the world in that way and to be so distrustful of others. And that comes as someone who has had to do a lot of things in their lives because I was alone and have had, I just had to do a lot of things alone and should think worse of others than I do if I were to lay out like my experiences. In one of my therapists once said, I'm surprised that you're still sane and functioning, as I laid out some of this stuff. But even with all that, I still think very deeply and highly of others, and that's the kind of world that I want to foster and propagate. As a permaculture practitioner, that's what I would encourage you to do as well, because there is security in community and helping one another. And I think that reading A Paradise Built in Hell helps that understanding of what those realities are from Rebecca's research. Really, really recommend it. Again, A Paradise Built in Hell. There's also, let me see if I can find this other title. Yes. There's some people who talk about the need for us to come together collectively around like gangs and like having our own gang, gang and our own people, but I don't really, again, doesn't resonate with me because it feels like violent and doesn't build us up. And so another book that I'd recommend is Tribe on Homecoming and Belonging by Sebastian Younger. By Sebastian Younger. And that book discusses the instinct that we have to belong to small groups that are, defined around a clear purpose and understanding, our tribe. And Younger looks at the way that our tribal connection has been lost in modern society, but that regaining it may be a way to remain healthy in the world, to maintain and build our emotional, mental health, and just our mental well-being. And thinking back, I don't know how much I've spoken about this on the show over the years. I myself have never served in the military due to health issues that just I couldn't serve. I couldn't pass the physical side of it. I did work as a civilian contractor at a military facility for several years in the beginning of my, was it 3 years? Yeah, I worked in a military facility and held a security clearance when I was starting my IT career in the late 90s. 98 till 2000? Yes, yeah, those were the 3 years that I served as a contractor at a military facility when I was younger, and served alongside a number of people who were in the military. I come from military families. My father served in the Navy. All my uncles and many of my aunts on my mother's side served. And so that's just a world I kind of grew up in. And I have friends who served. And one of the things that I'll be talking about in my piece on the Together We Can conference from Future Harvest was that there was a conversation on what were known as care farms and using farming as a therapeutic outlet for people, including someone who is a veteran who runs a veteran-focused care farm. And between all of that and my conversations with my friends who have served, who've come back from some places where they did some things and experienced some things, like I've heard a lot about their need and desire for community, and so how can we foster that as permaculture practitioners? Several of my buddies and several people I know are actively farmers because that's something that makes a difference for them, and all of that together makes me think, around that idea that Sebastian Junger writes about in Tribe, about finding the people who resonate with us, finding those groups that matter. I think about it from my own, as I say, leaning into my support structures throughout the pandemic. I did that as well. And I kind of have two tribes around that are organized around very different ideas and purposes, but are very meaningful to me. And they all, at their core, even though we may differ on many of the techniques, if you will, our ethics and principles are in deep alignment. And yeah, being able to say that to you now, I recognize how fortunate I am to have that, but also that I would recommend, read Tribe by Junger and see how that could help you in the world that you're in and build your tribe. As I said during the last live stream on community preparedness, I'm working on that virtually as well. So if you would like to be part of a virtual tribe or virtual community that we can aid each other in the ways that we're able to, let me know. And I'll be happy to add you to a private thread where we can have some conversations, and I'll pop a Discord up that we can communicate and work together on that. Again, show at thepermaculturepodcast.com is the best way to drop that, especially if you would like to stay private or anonymous and not in the public space here on the live stream chat. So the last couple of thoughts that I have around this is about some other books that I would recommend reading in order to kind of bring some things together and fill out your library when it comes to this kind of planning for an uncertain future. And I'll pop those up on the screen and talk about them here in a moment. But anybody who's still here in the chat, do you have any questions at all from everything that we covered today that you'd like to include that we can answer before this draws to a close? If you are watching this afterwards, feel free to leave a comment for the video, and I will come back and answer that in the future. So the final books that I wanted to recommend when it comes to this idea of planning for an uncertain future. Oh, hold on, let me grab that graphic real quick and drop it in here so you can see it. There we go. Two other books that I would recommend. everyone adding to their library are Gardening When It Counts by Steve Solomon and Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler. I recommend Gardening When It Counts because it is the most cohesive discussion on what it means to grow subsistent amounts of subsistent subsistent amounts of food on small acreage, and is one of the places where I come from the number that we could grow enough food for a whole diet, mind you, a whole diet for 4 to 10 people per acre, based on what Steve writes about. And that provides all of our fertilization, everything that we want to return back to the soil, and all the food that we would need to eat for a year. And he just lays it out very clearly, discusses his own experiences, what his diet is like, what he grows. Steve was the founder, if I remember correctly, also of Territorial Seed Company, and so shares a lot of ideas that come from his knowledge as a seed company owner, as a grower in that space. And it's just a wealth of information. You can get copies relatively inexpensively used, and it's just an amazing resource. And it's, yeah. I think I've bought that book at least 4 different times because of having given copies away on the show, sharing it with friends, and then wanting to make sure that I always have one around. If you want to grow food at a larger scale to accompany that, because you see your role as a grower in the long future, another book that I would recommend is Jean-Martin Fortier's Market Gardener. I think that's the title. I just saw it the other day. But that would be another book, because that takes the subsistence level growing that Solomon advocates for and expands it to something where you could be a community scale grower without a lot of land. That continues to be important to me because, land is still expensive. When I hear from listeners to the show, they're often growing on, no more than 5 acres available. Very often it is an acre under production, so how can they use that better? And those 2 books are ones that I recommend. Again, Gardening When It Counts by Steve Solomon, and then Jean-Martin Fortier's The Market Gardener, or The Market Garden. Yeah. I have an interview with him too, so if you'd like to hear some of the things that Jean-Martin talks about, I definitely check that out. The other book is Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler. Though a piece of fiction, it is just an amazingly well-written and inspiring look at a world in collapse and what some people do about it. It's not always easy. They deal with some things that are hard. Or the characters deal with some things that are hard, and it is definitely a hopeful apocalyptic novel. That what the characters experience, though terrible and happening in the middle of collapse, that there are a lot of just inspirational lessons that come from it. And it's another example of the way that fiction fills a role in our work and what we're doing, and the importance of fiction and people who are writing about these different scenarios and ideas, because it helps people imagine something that they might not see otherwise. And I had the interview with Jeff Christou about Utopia, his vision of what the world could look like with permaculture. There is, I think it's 407, is a novel by an Australian author that is carried by my friends at Meliodora Publishing, which you should be able to find at permacultureprinciples.com, the online store there, which is another fictional exploration of what the world could look like. There's also a recent short story collection that I need to look up. Again, there's an author who I follow. I think it's Gemma Amor. I may have that wrong, but it's a short story collection of horror authors looking at climate change And I'm really, really fascinated by that. Looking forward to reading a copy, and I might see if I can get Gemma on the show to talk about like the inspiration for her story, and that book. So yeah, if you have any recommendations for fiction that deal with, a world in transition, or that touch on a way that we can create a more beautiful, just, and verdant world in the middle of collapse, and visions that I can share with people, again, let me know. Um, I can only, though I've covered so much on the show over the years and have so many resources available, there's only so much that I can read or know about any given day or any given year. And so your feedback is greatly appreciated if you can send me that. So finally, for this stream, since no more questions have popped up in the thread, I just want to let you know that there are the next couple of live streams and the topics are already scheduled. So you can see that here if you'd like to join me again. Here, the next one, is on February 1st. And we'll be talking about designing for fire. That'll pull from my own thoughts on wildfires living in an eastern woodland. I'm going to go back and review my episodes with Oliver Gaucher on designing for disasters, the conversation with Matt Fiddler on wildfires and California and what happened in California. And then some of the comments that were dropped in the last video about like the American Southwest, so we can kind of look at California's climate and talk about fires. We can talk about the eastern woodlands and fires. We can talk about the American Southwest and fires, and discuss some of the pieces around like what plants and plant guilds and things like that. So that's what I have in mind. If you've gotten this far in the live stream and are still with me and you're hearing that, definitely let me know if there's anything that I can fill in for you when it comes to designing for disasters. After that, I'll be digging a bit more deeply later in February on that idea about focusing on design and touch on more examples of what to do in that way to, fill in the holes and answer your questions. And then after that is a conversation on a permaculture livelihood and some thoughts on not just the business of permaculture, but the people I know who are making a living doing this kind of work, how they're cobbling together that lifestyle and their living. And particularly wanting to focus on if you have a little bit of land and what you can do to create a tangible business outside of the common permaculture, take a PDC and design and teach, because that area is honestly kind of saturated. And so there are different ways that we can do this that are meaningful, and to do it in the landscape. And if you think of any other ways to look at this outside of capital, or you have questions about ways we can do this outside the realm of capital, again, drop a comment, email me, let me know, as that is some of what I want to touch on when it comes to a permaculture livelihood, so that we can take a broad approach rather than just continuing to dig into the same old. But as I say, we'll get into all of that in future weeks. More episodes from the podcast are coming here shortly as I stream today. That includes the interview with Della Duncan, the Rogue Economist, which will be out either later today or tomorrow for patrons, and then for general release 3 days later for everyone else. If you haven't checked it out, definitely check out the podcast Patreon community at patreon.com/permaculturepodcast. I do monthly AMAs. There are posts about the live streams that go there. As reminders, there are weekly updates that let you know what's going on behind the scenes, who I'll have on the show soon, what I'm currently working on for like the next episode that's currently in the queue for just kind of everything that's going on at the show. And that's a great way to get in touch and stay up to date for that. The calendar page for the permaculture at the calendar page at thepermaculturepodcast.com/calendar has been updated to reflect those upcoming live streams. The upcoming release order, since I'm moved away from a schedule, you can find the order of what will be coming out in the near future there. And then, I will be getting back on the road to record in-person interviews sometime this spring, provided that the case rates in the United States start to decline again and I feel comfortable. Right now, I'm looking at some local in-person interviews with some folks who are doing biosolid conversion, taking municipal waste and turning it into slow-release fertilizer. And I'm really interested to talk with those folks about that. Looks like I'm going to be talking with not only the folks at the company, but also with some of their partners in the waste management community. So that should be a pretty interesting video, I think. But those details are coming together. But where I'm at is I'm looking to start local. I'm gonna decide here on. Let me grab the date real quick because I had it up recently. On February 7th is where I'm going to re-examine case rates here in Northern Virginia and decide whether or not I feel comfortable going out and doing local interviews. If I do, then probably the week of February 21st, if all goes well, crossing fingers, but that date or a little bit after, I will go and have these conversations about this biosolid product and then look at expanding outward from there. And then I also am looking at the end of March as my first permaculture road trip in a number of years, heading down to North Carolina, again, COVID accepted, to stop by and visit Drew and Lacey of the Schoolhouse Life and talk with them about their work and projects and shoot a short documentary with them at their location, then cut west over to Asheville to go spend some time with Natalie Bogwalker of Wild Abundance to talk about what's happening there and everything that's going on, and then visit with some folks who she recommends, and hoping also to get over to Earthaven. But who I will visit and when beyond the Schoolhouse Life and Drew and Lacey or Wild Abundance and Natalie are kind of open-ended, waiting on figuring out some of these other pieces. So once I know for sure when I'll be there and where, to schedule with some folks at Earthaven and elsewhere in the community. But really looking forward to that. And yeah, it should just be fun. And then finally getting to put all of this work that I've been doing behind the scenes when it comes to video editing with different software and across different platforms, including, putting something together on an iPad with iMovie versus having access to the full Premiere Pro from Adobe on my desktop for video editing, reaching out to some friends about, where do you get your music? Where do you get your voiceovers? Who are your voiceover actors you work with? And compiling all of that over the last 2.5 years in preparation for doing this in-person work. I'm just really excited about it, to finally do it and make mistakes and learn along the way, and then to hear from you what you think of it, and where I should go next and who I should work with. And yeah, I'm really excited to be able to continue the podcast as it exists with these ongoing longer format episodes, and then be able to move into a different media space as well. Similarly, I have a meeting with some folks tomorrow who are indie and small scale book publishers about what they do to get books to market and ready for distribution electronically or by print, because I've been working with some clients behind the scenes, helping them do their preparation for media appearances, giving editorial and proofreading feedback on books to permaculture authors. And I'd like to do some more work in that space and around that. So meeting with them to make sure that I'm, taking care of everything in order to do that. And so if you're someone who's working on a book in the permaculture community or the permaculture adjacent space, let me know. I'd be more than happy to help you either one, get your manuscript together and ready to go out into the world, or to take some time together when it comes to your media outreach and preparing for that. But yeah, it's all super fun and exciting, and I really look forward, as I say, to sharing all of that with you in the future. It does seem that I can speak extemporaneously pretty well now that we're more than an hour and a half into this, and I thought I might only be able to cover 45 minutes or so. But I will leave you to the rest of your day. Thank you all so much for joining me for this. And yeah, I'll join you again for another live stream here in a few weeks and the next episode in a few days. Take care, everyone.